In this lecture, we're going to look at our more traditional ways of punishing people in the criminal justice system. And of course, when we're talking about our more traditional ways of punishment, we're talking about the use of jails and prisons. In fact, jails and prisons are the centerpiece of our system of punishment. When somebody commits a crime, you remove them from society, you put them in a confined space until they do their time, and then they are released back into society. From 1972 to today, we've been expanding our U.S. prison system. This is regardless of whether crime was rising or falling in the United States. In other words, we keep building more prisons. And the number of prisons that we keep building doesn't really correspond with the crime rate, whether it's falling or rising. In fact, our prison population hit its historic peak in 2008-2009, where we had 2.3 million people in our country in a U.S. jail or prison. In fact, the United States has this dubious distinction of incarcerating more people than any other country, any other democracy in the world. So the U.S. imprisons a larger number of its citizens for a longer period of time than any other industrialized democracy in the world. Our incarceration is 5 times higher than any other country. And if you look at how many people we incarcerate, just to give you an idea, there are more people behind bars in Alabama than all of Canada, just to give you a sense of the magnitude. And there are 5 states that typically have the highest incarceration rates. And you can see that these are states that are in the South: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, and Oklahoma, with the highest incarceration rates in the United States. So just to give you an example, I mean, crime rates in this country have been falling since 1990 something, but our incarceration rates have grown. So if you go back to the 70s, for example, we imprisoned about 110 out of every 10,000 people in the population. So for every 100,000 people in the population, 110 of them were behind bars. Beginning in 2013, for every 100,000 people in the population, we incarcerated 480. So it's quite a jump. So why do we see this rise in prison population? Well, first of all, we've seen the trend in this country of longer sentences for some crimes. And this is particularly true for drug crimes, but other crimes as well. There were also many states passed mandatory sentencing rules, such that if you were convicted of a crime, a judge did not have the discretion to give you other types of sentences like probation or parole, probation or some kind of diversion. In fact, they were mandated to sentence you for X amount of time. So mandatory sentencing then increased the prison population. Another policy that resulted in greater number in the prison population were 3 strikes rules that some states passed. So for example, California passed this 3 strikes rule, where if you had committed 2 felonies and committed a third, 3 strikes and you're out, and you're mandated to a life in prison term. So when you have these 3 strikes rules, then obviously you're going to increase the population. At the same time you have these things going on, there was a reduction in this country in the use of parole, in letting people out for good behavior. There was also an increased imprisonment of juveniles. You saw more juveniles being transferred to adult courts, and once they're transferred to adult courts, then they can receive prison sentences. And I mentioned this already, but I think this is really important. There were huge increases, huge penalties for drug crimes, increased penalties. So all of those things coming together increased our prison population page. So when you look at the demographics of our prison population, you see some interesting trends. And this is something that's going to come up in the movie The 13th. We know that black men are incarcerated at 6 times higher rate than white men. And black males between the ages of 20 to 34 have the highest rates of incarceration. We're going to be looking a little bit at this. Also, if you look at lifetime rates of incarceration, you see there are also ethnic and racial differences. So the lifetime chance of incarceration, and by the way, this is all males that we're talking about here at this point. So if you're a white male, the chances that you will be incarcerated at some point in your life is 5%. If you're Hispanic, it goes up to 16%. And if you're a black man, it's 29%. So you see some pretty stark racial discrepancies, which we'll talk about later. With regard to gender, I said that most of the data we're talking about has to do with males, and that's because 93% of the people incarcerated in our country are male. And so, why? Why is it why are males such the focus of this attention here? Well, obviously, one of the main things is that women actually commit crimes at a much lower rate than men do. So that may be one of the reasons that they're less likely to be incarcerated. But actually, it's not, there's more going on than just that. So if you look at some studies, you find that women are treated much more gently in the criminal justice system than men. So, for example, some studies have looked at women and men who have committed similar crimes. So you equate for the crime, and you find that women typically get lighter sentences than men for committing the same crime. Also, there was one large-scale study that looked at drug crimes and property crimes, and they found that women were less likely to be sentenced to prison for drug and property crimes than men. And if you look at violent crime, so women are less likely to commit violent crimes, but some do. So there was one study that looked at violent crimes. So these are men and women who have committed violent crimes. And they found that women and men were both as likely to be sentenced to prison. So if you're violent, chances are you're going to be sentenced to prison. However, the interesting thing about this study, they found that women, although they were likely to be sentenced to prison, they received significantly shorter sentences than men. So you see these huge gender disparities, probably because women commit fewer crimes, less crime, but also they're treated more gently by the justice system. Okay, now let's take a look at why we see this, the types of imprisonment that we have available in this country, and a little bit about each of these types. So there are really three types of incarceration. One is jails, and we're going to talk more about each one of these, so don't worry about it. Then we have our federal and state prisons at a higher level. And then finally, we have a new type of prison. It's called a supermax. And we're going to talk about each one of these separately and talk about some of the issues regarding each one of these types of incarceration. So let's take a look at jails. Jails are typically administered by local authorities. These are short-term holding cells that are operated by cities or counties. So the people that are in jails are often convicted of misdemeanors, and they're held in jail. You can also have people who are convicted of violent crimes who are awaiting trial who might be housed in a jail until their conviction. But because the administration of jails lie within cities or counties, and the local authorities are in charge of these jails, there's wide variation in jail operations. What you see in Albany County might not be the same as what you'd see in Laramie County, and so forth and so on, because the local authorities have a lot of say in how a jail is run. When we look at jails, the most consistent problem that's cited is overcrowding, such that they have many more people in these jails than they can safely house. And so that's a consistent problem that you'll see mentioned with regard to jails. Okay, let's take a look at federal and state prisons. Federal and state prisons. This picture right there is a picture of part of the facility at our Rawlins State Prison here in Wyoming. Federal and state prisons hold convicted criminals for longer periods of time. These are people that have been sentenced for not misdemeanors, and they're held for longer periods of time. About 1% of the people who are in our federal or state prisons are on death row. So they're awaiting death. And as we talked about before, some of them will wait a very long time. Our federal prisons obviously are inmates who broke federal law, so they're in a federal prison. The state prisons, inmates who broke state law. And so, as you might guess, there are far more people incarcerated within state prisons than federal prisons. Within this broad group of prisons is a variation from minimum to maximum security. So that there are prisons that are minimum security prisons, often for people who commit nonviolent offenses or white-collar crimes. They might be sentenced to a minimum security prison. There, you're likely to see that prisoners are held in cottages or dorms, and they might interact with each other with few restrictions. They might do light prison labor. They may have the ability to exercise and may even be able to carry on some part-time job outside of the facility. All the way up to your maximum security prisons, which will have very few of those options. Okay? Is a fairly new prison in our system. Supermax prisons are reserved for people who are thought to be especially dangerous. And this is Supermax prisons are an extreme and largely unprecedented type of confinement. In the past 25 years, 44 states have built one or more Supermax prisons. So this is a fairly new type of incarceration. They are more costly to build and more costly to operate, and you'll see why in just a second. Because inmates are held very closely in these Supermax prisons. So right there is a picture of a jail cell in a Supermax prison. The inmates are held in very tiny cells. As you can see, this is a very tiny cell. And in Supermax prisons, inmates often spend 23 hours of their day in these cells. Okay? When they get their meals, they often receive their meals through slots in the doorway. If you look right here, you can see the food is being delivered, but there's not even any interaction between the guard and the inmate. The food worker puts the food in the slot, closes the door, and then the inmate is able to open the door and get their food. Any kind of visitation is usually done through closed-circuit television. And many of these Supermaxes are extremely impersonal structures. Here's a Supermax in Arizona. As you can see, each one of these cells, it's like a large set of cages stacked on one another with the guards in the middle and an empty space in the middle. There's a heavy reliance on video monitoring so that the inmate is unlikely to see any person during their day. The only kind of contact that inmates typically get is when they have a 1-hour exercise period in the yard by themselves. So as you can see in this picture right here, when an inmate leaves their cell, they are shackled, okay, and taken out into the yard where they're allowed to exercise for 1 hour by themselves. When they go into the yard, they are often belted, shackled, hands and feet, in order to move them from one place to the other. The thing is that these Supermax prisons place these extremely high-risk inmates in these facilities for extended periods of time. And I don't know what you think about the Supermax prisons, but for me, one of the most frightening thing about the Supermaxes is that most of the people that are in Supermax facilities are not people who have been sentenced to life in prison. These are people who will eventually be released back into society. And so the question is whether or not the experience of being in a Supermax might make you less stable once you get out. Before I talk about what the supermaxes, the effect of supermaxes on the inmates, one of the things that we know is that when Supreme Courts are trying to decide whether or not a punishment is cruel or unusual, they often look to community sentiment. So supermax prisons are fairly new on the scene. And so the question is this a type of prison that's supported by the public at large? Now, the last time that I taught psychology and law on campus, I asked the students in the classroom, I showed them this slide with the facility, and I asked the students, does confinement in a supermax prison constitute cruel and unusual punishment? And I want to give you their responses. This is not a random sample. It's just a sample of students that were sitting in a class. But here were their responses. Does confinement in a supermax prison constitute cruel and unusual punishment? What you see here is 50% of the class said no. Okay? A quarter of the class felt that it was cruel and unusual, and another quarter felt torn. I'm not quite sure what to think about whether the supermax prison is cruel or unusual. And I point this out because this is very important. For many of the students in the class, when I was talking about supermaxes and showing them about them, this is the first time they'd heard about them. They'd heard about supermax prisons before. The vast majority had raised their hand, they'd heard about it, but they didn't really know that much about it. And just given that little bit of information, half the class said, no, this does not constitute cruel and unusual punishment. However, if you look at the effect of the supermax on the inmate, so these are studies that have looked at changes in inmates after spending time in a supermax prison. And there aren't a lot of studies, but there are some pretty consistent findings. And here is a huge list. Now, as you might expect, as the inmate spends more time in the supermax, the more likely you are going to see these symptoms and the more the stronger they'll be. So the effect is by the length of confinement. The effect also hinges on the vulnerability of the inmate. So what we find is that people who go into a supermax who already have some mental health problems, they become severely disturbed after spending some time in a supermax. So here are some of the symptoms: insomnia, not being able to sleep, chronic anxiety, violent fantasies, okay, confused thought processes. You don't really know whether it's day or night, uncontrollable anger, hallucinations, emotional breakdowns, depression, suicidal thoughts, and self-mutilation. These are the same kinds of things that you see when people are exposed to extended periods of solitary confinement, which the courts have agreed is cruel and unusual punishment. But the supermax is showing the same kinds of effects, but it's fairly new, and maybe people don't view it as the same as solitary. Just to give you an example, some courts now have kind of fought pushback. So for example, in California, there is a supermax prison called Pelican Bay. And the courts rule that before an inmate can go to Pelican Bay, they have to be evaluated by a mental health staff. And if they're deemed mentally unstable, you cannot send them to Pelican Bay. In other words, now the courts are starting to say that not every inmate can handle a supermax facility. If you look at some of the psychiatric facilities in these supermax prisons, if they have something, it's not very much. So for example, going back to Pelican Bay, the inmates who need some kind of psychological therapy usually get drug therapy. And when they do therapy with a therapist, the inmate is typically in a plexiglass cage working with their therapist. So it's not optimal. It's certainly not optimal. Okay. So because of some of the problems associated with the effect that supermaxes have on inmates, there have been people that have suggested reforms. One, of course, is special training and supervision of correctional staff. They're in a very high security situation, and some of the inmates may be experiencing some mental illness because of it. Another reform is to prevent mentally ill convicts from being sent to a supermax prison because it's likely going to exacerbate their symptoms. Another is to allow prisoners to meet with mental health professionals. Now again, you have to do it safely so the mental health professional is not in danger, but somehow allowing prisoners to have some interaction with mental health professionals. Allowing some interactions between inmates in dining halls. In the supermaxes, you do not see another person. And so there is absolutely no other human interaction except for the guards when they take you out. The ability to allow some educational programs, whether it's even in the cell, with some distance learning and being able to get some educational and skill training. And finally, to limit the duration of the supermax confinement. So if you're going to send someone to a supermax, to not allow that person to stay for very long, because the longer they stay, we know the more all of those symptoms are likely to occur. Now, I told you about this informal survey that I did in class one time asking about support for supermax. There's only one other study that I found that looked at public support of supermax model. This was a study that was published in 2013, and they looked at a representative sample of Florida residents. So it's not generalizable to the rest of the country, but at least it was a representative sample in Florida. What they asked, they told a representative sample of people that supermax security prisons are facilities where certain inmates are housed indefinitely by themselves for 23 hours per day. The inmates typically have few, if any, opportunities to receive programs, treatments, or visitors. Supermaxes generally cost 2 to 3 times more to build and operate than any other prison. So they're given this basic definition. And then they were asked 3 questions. They were asked, how much do you support the use of supermax prisons to handle inmates who are disruptive, violent, or difficult to manage? Okay. Second question, if the only benefit of a supermax prison was to help prison officials manage inmates and not to reduce crime in society, how much would you support having supermaxes? So in other words, you're basically saying this is not going to reduce crime and it's not going to do anything except help manage inmates. Are you still supportive? And then how much do you agree that placing inmates in a supermax type of prison is inhumane? Again, looking at this sort of cruel and unusual punishment. So let's look at the results. By the way, it could go, the question was, the 3 questions, you could go 1, which was strongly oppose, all the way to 4, which is strongly support. So it was a scale from 1 to 4. And that's important when you look at the results. So let's take a look at the results of the study. So remember, our endpoint was 4. And what you see here is there was pretty high support of the supermaxes in handling violent or difficult inmates. So that you have basically with, if you looked at the scale 2.5 right here, oops, let me go back. From 1 to 4, a 2 would be sort of neutral. And you can see that support was definitely above 2 in all of these categories, but certainly for violent offenders. The second one was if it was only used to manage prisoners, do you still support? And you can see that there is still support for supermaxes. And then, by the way, the last question it asked about inhumane. 1 was that you strongly agree that it's inhumane. To 4, you strongly disagree. In other words, you think it's humane. So you can see that there is a lot of support. There is a lot of support endorsing the supermaxes, even if there was no crime reduction or benefit to society. Look right here. It didn't drop down to 2. There was still support. And And when the public is asked whether or not supermaxes are inhumane, the average was more than 2.8, which suggests that, in fact, they don't think it's inhumane. In fact, in this particular survey, 71% of the participants disagreed or strongly disagreed that supermax prisons are inhumane. So at least right now, there seems to be a lot of support from the public for these types of prisons. Before I end, let me just tell you some other results from this study. Men were found to be more supportive of supermax prisons than women. Whites, as compared to Hispanics or blacks, were also more supportive. And older individuals were more likely to be supportive than younger individuals. And then finally, income was a predictor, but not in the exact way that you would predict. So income, individuals with incomes placing them on the threshold of poverty, or within $10,000 to $15,000 of the threshold of poverty, express greater support relative to the very poor. So the only income difference was that people who were in working class or very close to poor tended to be more supportive of supermaxes than the very poor. So it's almost the very poor versus the almost poor. Okay. The non-significant factors, things that didn't predict responses in the questionnaire, were political ideology, so it didn't matter Republican or Democrat, religiosity, and whether or not you had been a victim of a crime or you worked in the criminal justice system or anything like that, or whether you had offenders who were family members and so forth and so on. So I guess the moral of the story, at least right now, is that there tends to be a lot of public support for these prisons. They're fairly new, but it may be that the support comes from the fact that the public doesn't really know a whole lot about supermax prisons and what exactly it means when you put someone in a supermax. I wish that some of these studies would ask people if they know that the individuals in the supermax prisons are going to return to society, or whether they think they're there for good. Anyway, it's very interesting to look at. In our next lecture, we're going to take a short look at some of the changes in the courts having to do with prisoners' rights, and whether there's a pendulum swinging in the courts right now with regard to the rights of prisoners once they're incarcerated.